Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be reacting to a video. This is something that's been making the rounds on YouTube recently, so it's the SR problem and why something has to change, and it's titled Classic WoW, but I think that they're also talking about kind of what's going to happen going into the Burning Crusade. A lot of people have been concerned about that, and they're basically just talking about the hard res culture, I believe. And I'll be talking about that a little bit in the video as we reply to things, because I think that soft reserve can be distinct from hard reserve, but it very rarely is, so I understand why people kind of make the argument that SR is bad, because obviously it has all the baggage of HR that goes along with it, just because that's how people tend to run the runs, right? It's very rare that you get a soft reserve that's just pure soft reserve where anybody can reserve what they want, so I'll be keeping that in mind as we kind of go through the video. But yeah, we'll just start it off, and we'll see what's happening here.
Welcome back to the channel. I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind for quite a while now, and with us only having one reset before we progress into the pre-patch moving into the Burning Crusade, I think it's time to address a huge issue, and that's the SR problem. I want to be very clear as we talk about these SR runs. I'm specifically talking about the true pug experience. I'm not talking about a guild organized run for ZG or AQ20 that's bringing 10 to 15 guildies along, or a Molten Core that has 30 players from the same guild. At that point, it's no longer an SR run, it's just a guild organized run that's using the SR loot system. These two environments are completely unfair to compare, they are going to be drastically different, and for that reason, I'm going to exclude that from the conversation. Now,
like I said, I just want to start, I think that's pretty fair, right? What he's saying there is 100% true. Definitely different environments, so it's a good start for sure.
I quickly shoot down some of the solutions I see all the time in the YouTube comments or anytime I mention it over on Twitch. Join a guild. This just doesn't work. Sure, in the short term of things, while you're clearing the current content, whether that be Molten Core, Blackwing Layer, it's going to be perfectly fine and it's going to be fantastic. But at some point, your guild is going to be stretched thin and you won't be running the older raids that you still probably need. If you're running Naxxramas right now as a guild, you're likely not doing Molten Core or Blackwing Layer. And not to mention, maybe your guild just can't roster additional characters. So for that reason, you're going to be stuck going into an SR run, or maybe just not doing those raids at all, which is also the next solution. Just don't join.
Okay, so I'm going to pause right here before we get to like the next one, because we're kind of going one to the other, which is fine. I do the same thing in my videos. But I wanted to comment on the guild thing, because I actually do think that this tends to be something where it's more of just a player problem, in my opinion, honestly. And it's honestly a problem of people just not wanting to invest time into the game, and it's really just people not wanting to invest time into a game where the whole point of the game is sort of time investment. There's a lot of other MMOs out there that are quote-unquote more respectful of your time, I would say, and Classic WoW is just not one of them necessarily, right? It's very grindy. The loot is intended to be scarce, right? It's not really meant to be a thing where you're meant to get the BIS items. And yeah, if you can't run multiple raids a week, there's a couple things that were mentioned there, right? So the first one is, some people just don't have time to raid in a guild. And I understand that, but their experience is by design going to be worse than somebody who does have time to raid in a guild, because the whole point of joining a guild is that you're kind of building some type of equity with the players in the guild. So the idea is that, they understand that you're reliable, you show up every week, you do your job, you perform, and when you're not in that guild situation, you're not building that equity, so you're going to be subject to these pug runs where there's a lot of interchangeable pieces like he's talking about, right? Like people kind of just pop in, pop out, and then, maybe you see them next week, maybe you don't. There's really no guarantee of people coming back to the same runs, which makes it really difficult to get gear in some cases, because if somebody gets a BIS item, they can just leave the next week or not be in that run, and then you run into this problem of like, well, in a guild, that BIS item, even if you don't get it, it's kind of a benefit for the entire guild, right? And it still benefits you if somebody else gets it, because now you are kind of one step closer to getting it when it drops again. That's not the case in these pug sort of runs, right? So there's all sorts of negatives of pugging in this game. I would say one of the positives to counterbalance that is you have a lot more freedom in terms of what you are trying to pursue. So, for example, if you're doing like a normal guild run, right, you may not even have the option to get something like a rejuvenation gem. Like when it drops, it might not even have a chance to go to you, which is sort of a big deal because some of these items are pretty rare in Classic, especially because we only get one lockout and not a lot of loot drops. So for some guilds, they might get 6 rejuvenation gems, right? For other guilds, they might get 1 gem. Now, if you're in the guild that drops 6 gems, then it feels pretty good to be in the guild, right? Because you're probably going to end up getting a gem if you're a reasonably good player in that guild. Even if there's a lot of officer bias or something like that, by the time everything's kind of panned out, you're probably going to get a rejuvenation gem. The problem is if you're in one of those guilds where only 1 gem dropped for you, now it might have been a bad decision to be in that guild, right? Because you would actually rather have been a pug, even a SR pug, where, sure, everybody might be reserving Rejuve Gem, but at least you have a chance to get it when it drops. Whereas if you were in, a guild where it was like hard res to an officer or the healing class lead or something like that, you were just never going to get it if 1 drops. So there's advantages and disadvantages here, for sure. But yeah, typically speaking, it's going to be just harder for you to accumulate more loot rating as a pug, and that's just a reality of the game. And when that's combined with the game already having or already being very focused on loot scarcity, then yeah, it's just not going to feel good all the time. But I think that's kind of just how the game is, in a way, right? A lot of people like the loot scarcity aspect, and it's not necessarily going to be solved by other loot systems or by GDKP even. I'm not saying that he's saying that here, but it's sort of like a little bit of the implication, right? That this problem could be solved, but in reality, it's not really going to be solved in any method you're doing pug-wise, right? Because you're always going to be competing against lots of other players for these items, and unless you join a guild with static, where you're going to be competing against the same players over and over again, you have a chance to drop multiple of the item, you're not really going to get a great solution to that problem. So I think this is one of those things where a lot of people don't like to hear it, but it sucks to not be in a guild in most cases. In some cases, it gives you like a little bit more freedom, like I said, but in a lot of cases, it's going to be a disadvantage. And if you're not able to be in a guild, I think you really just kind of need to accept that if you're going to play Classic WoW. Let's keep going here.
If you find a run that has hard res Onslaught Girdle and that's the item that you're after, sure, keep looking for another couple of hours to find the run that you're actually after. Most people just don't have the time to do that, unfortunately, and they're just going to choose the third option, which is don't raid at all. Starting things off, the hard res meta is just so much worse.
Okay, so he's talking about the other option that people talk about as well, just don't go to the runs that, have stuff in them that you want, that are hard res. And he's basically saying that the alternative is that you're not doing runs, right? Because you basically, to invest the amount of time it would take to find a run where all the stuff that you want is not hard reserved, maybe that takes too much time, so people end up caving. And this is true, but again, I think it's kind of just a matter of principles, right? I've never gone to a run where I was not okay with the items that are being hard reserved. And sure, from my perspective, as I mostly run as a healer, I do run as DPS sometimes, and it is going to be easier for me to find runs where I don't have to worry about certain things being hard reserved. That's actually kind of a reason why I've done a lot of SR runs in this kind of iteration of Fresh, so these anniversary servers that have come out. Because as a healer, you can kind of work around a lot of these restrictions a lot of the times because they don't really target you. However, if I was like a DPS warrior main in this version of Fresh, the reality is I would just be in a guild or I wouldn't play. Or if I was playing, I would have very different set of expectations than what I would have in a guild, right? And yeah, I think that's just kind of like the bottom line. I'm not going to let somebody kind of like scam me out of loot. And I think you guys just have to have that same mentality. If everybody had that mentality, these people would not be able to hold people hostage for items like Onslaught Grill and things of that nature. There's some cases, I feel like, where you have these kind of runs that border on being a pug / being a guild run, or they're sort of more consistent at least, right? In those types of situations, I kind of get hard res, because the idea, especially for hard resing stuff to a tank, makes a bit more sense, because, you know, if you have a tank that is in it for the long haul, and he's going to tank for you guys for a while, then I can understand wanting him to have items like Onslaught Girdle, you know, DFT, things that are going to increase his threat. So in situations like that, I can kind of understand the hard res, and I might be willing as a DPS warrior to kind of work around that, you know, as long as the hard reserve gets removed after basically like the first main tank gets his items. But by and large, yeah, I'm not trying to go to runs where things I want are reserved, and you guys shouldn't either. That's just the reality. And if it means not raiding for the week, I don't understand, like I would rather not raid for the week than function as somebody's slave, which is kind of what's happening in a lot of these hard res runs. And I think he's about to get into that in a moment, because he's talking about the greed that goes on with these runs. And I agree, it's incredibly greedy. And people will try and say, oh, you know, I need some sort of incentive to start the run. And it's like, okay, buddy, like these runs have been going on for years where people haven't had you know, anywhere near the incentives like you're talking about now. Like, and this is not like a small incentive. You know, I think people would rather pay like a fee in gold to the organizer to get into the run if it was a small fee. You know, let's say that like, you know, everybody in the raid paid the organizer 10 gold or something like that. You know, that's 400 gold right there. That's quite a bit to cover a lot of his consumes at least. And they'd be much more okay doing that than making sure they're, you know, having him hard reserve whatever he wanted, and that's his justification for doing the run. So things could be worked out differently, but loot, given that it's already so scarce in this game, the fact that you're just going to give it over to one of these people for free is absolutely insane to me. So yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of a player problem at the end of the day. Like, the players are facilitating this. The people aren't like magically signing up to the runs, right? And in a lot of cases, it's not even players that like don't need things that are coming, right? Because so many things tend to get HR'd in some of these runs that you're bound to hit, you know, you're bound to hit items that people need. And I think people get confused when it comes to the HR, because they, like, I've seen this happen before with healers where people are like, oh, well, I'm not going to get Rejuvenation Gem anyway, man, because, you know, 10, 12 people are going to be rolling on it. So I don't really care if it's hard reserved, because I wasn't going to get that item anyway. And that's such a terrible mentality to have. And I think that's why a lot of these runs get filled to begin with. But what you don't realize is that even if it's unlikely for you to get that item, you know, by giving that item away to somebody else, is not only giving them an advantage over you intrinsically if it drops, but it's also kind of reducing the chance you have at other loot, because now that item can't even absorb all the pressure. Like, think about an item like a Rejuvenation Gem. If it's allowed to be reserved, right, it's going to draw a ton of reserves. Those are reserves you don't have to compete against on other items. And if it's just hard reserve, now all those reserves kind of go into the void. So yeah, I think people need to think a lot more carefully about how these hard reserves affect their loot priority. And it's not just about, do you want that item? Even if you already had something like Rejuvenation Gem, you still want Rejuvenation Gem to be not hard reserved in your run, because it draws, again, reserves away from items that you want, right? So yeah, people need to think about this a lot more. I don't think that they do. And yeah, I mean, just why are you hurting yourself, guys? Like, why are you going to runs where you're essentially farming loot for other people? It makes no sense. Stop doing it. And if you did, then this culture would change by force, right? So
selfish and promotes just a terrible environment for players to pug in.
I agree with this.
I've never grouped
completely.
up with hardly any of the same players from soft res runs. Once I win my BIS, that's it for the raid tier. And that's a huge problem with a lot of the SR runs. Most of the people that you're doing these groups with are undergeared or in just the prerequisite for that tier, and that's it. You're not ever having these players come back in with full BIS. Once they get those big ticket items, they're moving on. and it just diminishes the player count of how many people are going to go back to some of these older raids, leading to lower quality runs. And I just have a plethora of clips. And
I think that this is not necessarily super true, or at least it's not only true for soft reserve runs, right? You see this happen in GDKPs as well, right? When people kind of get their gear, they're not necessarily as concerned about coming necessarily. And you'll see sort of the opposite as well, right? Where sometimes if people do get their gear in a soft reserve run, they just like staying in the run. It really just depends on how well organized the run is and how like tight knit it is. And I think the thing that you're seeing on Anniversary is that because GDKP is not in the game, people have less incentive to kind of do extra runs, right? And when there's less incentive to do extra runs, less runs exist as a whole, and therefore you're not seeing as many people that you would normally see. For example, like, so if GDKP was in the game and you were running like there was one point in SOM, like I always talk about, where I was running like 5 priests a week or 5 priests and a druid or something like that. I think I even had a shaman mixed in there. So I was doing like a lot of raids per week, kind of like every lockout. And yeah, you kind of see the same people. Like people would see me in every run, right, on different characters. But do I even necessarily want to be doing that all the time? I mean, not necessarily. I'm kind of doing it because I'm getting a financial benefit from it, right? And if I wasn't doing the GDKP, I wouldn't be doing the runs. So it's not even necessarily that everybody wants to be there raiding, but it's just so lucrative that they can't avoid doing it in the GDKP system. I don't think that this is like not a super big difference between the SR system and the GDKP system, right? It's just that people are going to be doing GDKP more because it's so lucrative, because you're essentially thriving off all the gold that the whales spend, right? If GDKP was not so lucrative, like if you weren't running in these kind of high tier runs, people wouldn't bother doing GDKP. You know, you're not going to run like 5 or 6 extra raids a week on multiple characters if you're not getting compensated for it, right? And people see this as a good thing, right? They're like, well, yeah, but this causes more rating. But it's like, well, yeah, it's only causing more rating because it's siphoning off of the RMT, right? So yeah, I think this is a point that people get confused on, is that you can have these types of systems in SR runs where people kind of come back. I think he mentioned this later on in the video, where you can have these kind of groups evolve around soft res runs. It's just that they're a bit more rare because people tend to not want to do as many runs, right? Which I think is normal in a normal rating environment.
Just make the whole video
people
about
treat
how bad some
rating
of these runs
is like
really
gold
are.
farming.
Wiping on the first boss in AQ20 and then just
game.
leaving. Players just AFKing on trash and then rolling on car loot to win the rolls. I just have countless of examples, and I'm not going to make the whole video about that. And something new that's been happening very recently
this type of behavior, again, though, this can happen in any sort of run, really, right? And, you maybe have a more direct control over it with GDKP in a bit, because you can kind of be like, well, I can just dock you for this entire run. Like, I can take your whole cut, right? And you're getting something from a run, a GDKP run, where you may not be getting something in your average SR run. But if you're talking about your average GDKP run, right, so not like a souped up run, then even taking their cutaway is not really that big of a deal, right? If somebody, just doesn't want to be there, like let's say you have kind of like a whale that's hiding out in normal GDKP runs and he's just waiting to snatch a certain item. If his item doesn't drop, I mean, he doesn't really care that he's going to lose the 100 gold payout or whatever at the end of the run. I've still seen people leave in those cases, right? I've still seen terrible GDKP runs. Like back when GDKP was more the predominant system, there were still terrible GDKP runs. It's just people have this kind of bias it's almost like built into them because they're so used to running in groups that are tight-knit and are formed around GDKP circles, carries and buyers, facilitating these whales that come in and spend lots of gold, which then gets distributed throughout the raid. So obviously, in those particular cases, those runs tend to go smooth. And if you're only running in those runs, then you are going to have relatively smooth rates. But, there were terrible GDKPs back in the day, and if you reintroduce GDKP back into the game, there's going to be terrible GDKPs in future runs. Nothing intrinsically about GDKP really protects that much against bad play outside of the community aspect, right? Because realistically, if you go to just some run-of-the-mill trade chat GDKP that pops up, you're not going to have this list of rules, and you're not going to really be able to justify even taking somebody's cut, because most likely you haven't really laid out an elaborate list of rules beforehand about what needs to happen for people to maintain their cuts, right? That tends to not be a thing with these run-of-the-mill GDKPs that kind of pop up. So just like you can kind of create rules and standards for GDKP in GDKP runs, you can create rules and standards for SR runs as well. And, you can just not invite these players back, which I think he gets into
Flask
at some
to
point.
get an additional SR. Some people offering up to 5, so you can have 5 total SRs.
I mean, this is...
Some of the organizers walking out with 45.
This is crazy. I mean, obviously this is bad as well. This kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, where if you're in a run like this, where you're seeing this, where you can donate flasks, especially multiple flasks, it's one thing to have somebody use a flask in order to make the run go better and then give them an SR for that. But having this thing where you can donate flasks to the guild and then get compensated for that is just obviously insane.
5 or even more flasks, just no tips for performance or anything like that, just completely pocketing the gold and just gloating about it the whole time pretty much. It's basically pay to win at this point with doing something like that, and it's just going to be even worse as we go into TBC. And on top of that, players have started to sell their SRs to other folks that already have the gear.
Yeah, I mean, this is not good, obviously, right? This can be prevented more.
There's very few people that do this. It's typically going to be the healers
but
that
unfortunately,
only need
if you're in a kind of a
gear,
run or a
or they're
system
just
where
there to
people
sell their
are
SR individually.
Already
Most of the
doing
time, the
things
DPS players are still going to be going there because everybody's on
trying
the same
to
SR.
get
And that's a big issue as
from
well.
the raid members,
everyone's SRing the same item. Molten Core, for example, in a 40-player raid,
people
all the
then
melee
sell
are
SRs
either on
and runs
Onslaught
like that.
Girdle, Quick
I've been
Strike
asked to
Ring,
sell
or
SRs
Striker's
and runs,
Barn. And that's
I refuse
basically
to do
the
it.
majority of all the SRs.
I think it's doing this is kind of pretty scummy. It goes against the...
For healers, everybody's on the ring. And so you're having to spend multiple raids to try to get the item to even drop, and then just losing it to someone that's AFK on trash. There's hardly any community when it comes to SR runs, and that's the biggest issue in my opinion. The community is the backbone of an MMO, and it's why so many players choose to play Classic WoW over retail. As far as I know, outside of Mythic raiding, the community aspect just doesn't really exist anymore. So many systems are now automated, no longer requiring you to interact with other players. There are very few communities to run SRs with consistently. There are a couple that do this independently throughout Discords and such, but most of which are guild organized runs that hard res a lot of the good big ticket loot.
Okay, so he mentions the community aspect. I mean, yeah, I do think that this is a bit of a... again, it's what are we comparing it to, right? The assumption is we're comparing it to GDKP. And if we're comparing it to GDKP, you can kind of make the same argument about GDKP, right? Nobody has to come back to the same GDKPs. There's some GDKPs that'll exist where nobody comes back, right? The ones that are more just pickup group. And then there's some that are a bit more solid and do have sort of a community around them. But, there's equivalent soft res runs to those as well. Like I said, it's just that less people want to form those and go to those because the benefits that come from them are less lucrative. Right. Again, this has less to do with the run itself, and it has more to do with the siphoning of the gold from the whales to everybody in the run, right? If you have kind of a normal run that's going on, then for a GDKP, you're not really gaining a ton out of that GDKP monetarily. If you go to it, even if you don't get... the items that you want or something like that, right? You're not really getting that much of a chunk of gold. You might be able to better spend your time going and farming somewhere else, right? So it may not really be worth it for you to invest the time into doing that GDKP. And, you're not going to have these guaranteed smooth runs either, right? But obviously, if you go to GDKPs where you're kind of pre-selecting people and the whole idea is to, you're trying to create an environment where you generate lots of gold, then yeah, obviously more people are going to want to participate in those types of runs, and less people are going to want to participate in soft res runs. So again, I don't think there's anything intrinsically different here that much about soft res versus GDKP. It's just that in GDKP you have the opportunity to take a lot of gold from the people who are doing the RMT essentially and spread it out throughout the raid. Whereas in the soft res runs, that opportunity doesn't really exist, and you might just leave the run getting nothing. So, when you have a soft res system, less raids tend to form. I don't think this is really a bad thing intrinsically, right? It's just something that happened on the system. If people don't want to raid, they don't want to raid, right? It's not the biggest deal. Like, I don't think that we should, like, more raids isn't necessarily better if it's encouraging RMT. So I'm going to actually end this here for now. I think I'm going to split this into 2 parts because this one's already kind of long. So I'll kind of review the next part of the video. I'll freeze it here, and we'll talk about that for the next video. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll do part 2 very shortly.